Let's go. So welcome to my thesis defense about GPU usage in real-time game audio tasks, which was made within the context of a research internship at DMUT. So everything started off at GDC 2025 when Ubisoft released a talk called GPU Ray Tracing for Audio in Snowdrop. At the game audio roundtable that followed, everyone was talking about just that. And everybody wanted to use the GPU to make audio tasks. So I discussed that with DMUT, and as a technical artist with high interest in game audio, I fell in love with the topic. So I absolutely wanted to answer those two questions to help the industry. What are the reasons for that emergence? And what is efficient to offload from the CPU to the GPU? And to answer those two questions, I went through different sources, such as the Game Audio Programming book series, the ADC talks, the GDC talks, and I discussed my hypotheses with industry veterans and game audio source providers. So to answer that first question, I had to cut it down into two smaller sub-questions. So the first one, why isn't CPU power enough? And the second one, why only now? To answer the first sub-question, well, to do better game audio, and especially more realistic game audio, we need more power. And when we talk about realism in game audio, we often think about game acoustics. But for that, in the game industry, audio often has only 10%, which is very few, especially when you want to make realism. But those two, they were there for many years, so why is it emerging only now? And the answer I provided in my thesis was first because of the Moore's law that shapes the tech industry. So Moore's law about CPU transistors doubling each 2 years, which is not catching up due to physical limits. So for the game audio department, this hurts a lot because it's heavily relying on the CPU. And so we need to find a way around that because Moore's law isn't dead, it's just deprecated. We have to think about workarounds with multithreading or using dedicated processors such as a GPU. But for that, we need a lot of research and development. But research and development is really hard to pull off, especially when you only have 10% of budgets in a project. But so talking about dedicated processors and the GPU, what is efficient to offload from the CPU to the GPU? And first things first, I want to mention, of course, AI, which is everywhere in our everyday life now, and that is already placed inside our computers and video games with things such as DLSS or frame generation. So we can potentially think about DLSS for audio, or also what's already being made, text-to-speech technology. But AI is a very complex topic that already needs a full thesis just about it, so I just want to mention it. So going back to more traditional way of using the GPU, I had to think the other way. So when is it inefficient? And the first thing is, well, when tasks are delay intolerant, the nature of audio makes it very spontaneous. Like, I cut my finger, I want to have the sound to be processed directly, spontaneously. Using the GPU, and especially asking it to give back to the CPU, requires a fixed amount of delay that sometimes doesn't match the CPU, the audio nature. Then we have everything that is bound from hardware dependency. Each GPU is different. Some has specific cores, some they don't have that. So you have to adapt each time, and this is really difficult for audio. Talking about cores, sometimes some cores aren't available inside a specific project. Like, let's say I have a huge project with a lot of AI discussions that needs a lot of tensor cores, then my GPU tensor cores are full. and I cannot use them. It's the same for every project, every core. Maybe sometimes it's a memory that is fully used. Sometimes it might be other things. Also, audio isn't that greedy in terms of power compared to graphics. You can have, let's say, a maximum amount of 100 emitters, physical playing emitters in a game. If you need only one computation per emitter, that's just 100 computations. That's not that much compared to what the graphics can really process. So if you do not have, let's say, thousands of computations per emitter, it's not really that useful. And finally, everything that is unparallelizable isn't going to work inside the GPU. So the nature of audio makes it that you process one sample at a time, and often the sample requires the previous one to process the data. With GPU, you have embarrassingly parallel tasks, and one task doesn't especially know what the memory is doing. So it's not especially useful. But with all those constraints, what is the industry capable right now? So what we are already seeing is the many conferences at the Audio Developer Conference, especially with a company literally called GPU Audio that explored many situations where they can use the GPU for audio, such as in cars, AI, games, and stuff like that. But specifically for the game industry, what's the most used is ray-traced acoustics, with many actors. So the first one, Housemarque, made Returnal in 2021 on the PS5, and they used PS5 ray tracing cores to process the acoustics. Then, of course, we have Ubisoft that made the GDC talk, but also previously a developed Brighton talk about Avatar's Frontiers of Pandora, and then at GDC they also have shown on Star Wars Outlaw. Then we have Versidium that is already making ray-traced acoustics on the CPU multi-threaded, and explored the usage of OpenCL on the GPU for that. Then we have SwitchTech developing a full solution of acoustics on Unreal Engine. We have CD Projekt Red with Colin Walder stapling in the Game Audio programming book series that we can use GPU to process the acoustics. And finally, we have Elias Audio giving an ADC talk about convolution reverb made by with ray-traced retracing cores. And finally, there's me doing my prototype. So I made two prototypes on each engine, Unreal Engine and Unity. So let's explore that. On Unreal Engine, I wanted to make something that is very accessible, so giving the access of ray tracing cores to audio developers with a hedgehog pattern, a shower pattern, and just basic direct hit patterns, which can be used for many audio tasks. It uses native ray tracing from Unreal Engine, so I had to think about stuff that we can use to filter out the geometry. So it is compatible with invisible geometry, Niagara systems, and GPU offset. So as you can see, the collision is made in CPU, which is static, but the GPU is moving the object. Here I explore the different scalability settings. So the amount of rays, of course, debugging rays takes a lot of performance, so that's why it looked a bit laggy there. Then we have the ray length that can be shortened or can be further away. And we also have the frame skips, which reduces the frame rate at which the rays are processed. So there we have 1, so it's almost instantaneous. Then we have 20, it refreshes in a very small range. To do that, I used the native hardware ray tracing for Unreal Engine, which means no cost of making the acceleration structure. But of course, as I explained, that requires us to filter out audio geometry. And to do that, I use the first-person rendering feature. So if you do not use the first-person rendering feature inside your game, the ray tracing mask that is used to process geometry isn't used at all, so I use that for my audio technology. And to process the patterns, I use the Fibonacci sequence for disks and spheres. On Unity now, I made a more creative prototype. So as you can see, so it explores obstruction and occlusion. And as you can see, as the doors closes, you can hear the sound muffling a bit more. Then here is the same, with each different faces disappearing. And each one has its own effect. And then the effect of surrounding trees that have small effects on the obstruction. To do that in Unity, I use the native unified ray tracing API on URP to process the rays launched between the emitter and the listener. I do a double cone, and to do that inside a GPU kernel, I have to separate rays. So each time you combine paired colors, you have the same amount of rays. So this is the same amount of rays, same amount of rays, same amount of rays, same amount of rays, and one big. In each cone slice, it's processed with the Fibonacci sequence again, and the result is sent to F-mode. So the upgrades that I can provide to my prototype, and the biggest one actually, is the setup cost on the game thread, on the Unreal Engine, and the main thread and Unity, which is actually the same. You can see that, in fact, the GPU isn't really that used at all. I mean, it's being used, but not as much as the CPU. So that's absolutely one thing I can upgrade, with, of course, many small optimization details. So conclusion, using the GPU for audio is possible, as Ubisoft has shown, within specific conditions, as the GPU is, of course, not made for audio. It's always up to the project and the specific requirements. And the goal is always to benefit the final experience, because it's just about having the tools to make the stuff and not being forced to use the tools. Thank you so much for listening, and it's question time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anthony, you want to start? Or?
No, go ahead.
So, I was just wondering why you have not integrated your numbers in your main text, or at least some significant result. Do you have anything that stand out in all your measurements that can bring some meaningful information, let's say, for your conclusion?
Yeah. So the main numbers I took a comparison with was the Ubisoft results from their GDC talk. They also had the same issue as we've seen with the profiling. So on the Ubisoft talk, they didn't show the same kind of graphics, but they also had a huge game thread and main thread processing cost compared to the GPU. And in fact, the GPU it's almost free because it's made asynchronously on the ray tracing cores, which aren't used all the time, especially when you do not do like heavy stuff such as path finding and stuff like not path tracing. But they still had a lower milliseconds than. But indeed, I didn't include those numbers in my thesis.
Okay. Well, it was really complete. You have lots of samples, and it's really meaningful on its own. But it could be good to have been integrated in. Well, bring some numbers there. Yeah, you're talking also in your implementation about your by gap rather than by step for the distribution. What's the real gain over uniform step? Why have you done that instead of just spreading uniformly?
So I initially have done that to remove one parameter inside the GPU. So when I set up the kernel, the ray tracing generation shader, I give the parameters, and I had to give the first parameter for the amount of rays of emitters. But then I had also to staple the amount of rays per slice, which could be avoided by using the bit shifting method. So that's why I use that. So I remove one parameter from the kernel.
Okay, I see. Yeah, there's a question about. Yeah, you have not done any equivalent CPU implementation like multi-threaded efficient one. So you're missing maybe some baseline to compare, and without that, how can you really say that the efficiency is there? I mean, it's quite difficult to compare when you're missing like a baseline for the comparison.
Yeah, the same question.
Yeah, I couldn't do multi-threaded CPU because it's not inside my knowledge, my capabilities. But it was quickly mentioned in Thesis, but it's not just about the optimization. It's about giving the access to another way of doing things. With GPU ray tracing, you have access to GPU geometry, like let's say the small leaves that are not a triangle but a cutout mesh. That kind of stuff, you cannot have that in CPU collisions. So it's also about giving newer opportunities.
Okay. You have questions?
Yeah. In the presentation, you mostly talk about direct hits from the source to the listener. Did you try with because you mentioned acoustic? Did you try actual acoustic reverbs, delays, stuff like that?
So there's many ways of doing acoustics. So acoustics is a blend between a lot of different smaller effects, such as so. In Unity, I have explored occlusion and obstruction. There's also propagation. There's also the late reverb, the early reverbs, and it's a lot to do.
Yeah,
of course. So I had to focus on one. And indeed, doing bounces with rays is interesting to do, which is made inside the Unity project, but very easily. So I bounced once. In the Unreal Engine project, I really wanted to be very generic and not forcing people to do one thing.
Sure.
So that's why there's not like pre-made bounces. Yeah. That's also why there's the direct hits. So you can, let's say, have a hedgehog pattern. You get every hit from the hedgehog. And from every hit, you can trace direct hits to the listener, which are indeed bounces.
Exactly. Okay, cool.
About that, have you tried to make like parallel with global elimination techniques they use for pathfinding and everything? Because it's also about rebounds. And so, is there anything that you have maybe seen that can be used for audio but was not made for audio at first, in the rebounds or whatever is implemented in RTX?
So if I understand correctly, you're asking me if other GPU techniques with ray tracing can be used for audio
Yeah,
instead
yeah, exactly.
of doing what we already do in CPU but with the GPU.
Yeah, yeah.
I really haven't thought about that. I mean, I've thought about the AI stuff about that,
Yeah,
such
yeah.
as DLSS, but not really about ray tracing. Also because ray tracing for audio can be optimized, such as I did with both projects. Instead of inputting a full buffer for the origins and a full buffer for the directions, I only have a full buffer for the origin and one single parameter for the listener, which is very related to audio because, let's say, 80% of the time we are just going to trace to the listener or with variations. Yeah. Anyway, so that's why I only was about how audio was made, because with that case I can optimize for how audio is made.